cries of newborn twins echoed through the tense hospital room. Something dark lingered beneath the surface, an eerie silence hinting at a secret. As the second baby emerged, Martin's heart pounded. He stared at the newborn's skin, different, unexpected. His world began to crumble, the unspoken question heavy. What did this mean for his family? The nurse hesitated, her eyes shifting between Martin, his wife, and the baby. The tension was unbearable. This was just the beginning, with one child fair-skinned like his wife, and the other, black as night. Something didn't add up. Not for Martin, not for the nurses exchanging glances, not for anyone present. Martin, eyes wide and heart pounding, glanced at Sophia, his beloved wife, and a question, an unthinkable question, clawed its way to the surface of his mind. Who did this child belong to? Sophia, push! Please, keep going! Martin's voice cracked under the pressure, his hands trembling as he held hers, which were clammy and pale. The love of his life was giving everything she had to bring their children into the world. But Martin couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach, a feeling of something gone terribly wrong. He glanced up at the doctor, whose face bore a look of concentration that quickly turned to worry. The first baby's cry rang through the air, and Martin smiled through tears. But then came the second. The room fell into stunned silence, broken only by the innocent cries of a baby who, even in their first seconds, had managed to sow discord and suspicion. One child's skin was white, but the other's, a deep, beautiful shade of brown, spoke to something Martin couldn't comprehend. His heart twisted in confusion. A father's instinct is to love, but his eyes deceived him, and his mind, it raced. Sophia, gasping, turned her head towards Martin. She whispered something he couldn't quite hear, her eyes glossy with exhaustion. And then, just like that, they closed. Permanently. The world turned to chaos. Martin screamed her name, a scream that seemed to claw its way out from the darkest corners of his being. Nurses moved around the room in panic. Machines beeped frantically, but nothing, no sound, no movement, would bring her back. The only constant were the cries of the newborns, cries that seemed to echo off the very edges of Martin's fractured heart. The doctor, her face covered in a mask of professional sympathy, gently placed a hand on Martin's shoulder. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, but the words didn't even reach him. His ears were filled with the sound of nothingness, an overwhelming void left by Sophia's absence. His eyes, red from tears and exhaustion, moved to the babies, and there it was again, that terrifying thought. How could they be his? One baby was white, one was black. A whispered thought turned into a deafening roar. He had to know. He had to know the truth. Rosa, Martin's mother, arrived soon after, the news having traveled faster than he could even comprehend. Her face was lined with grief, but also strength. She'd come to help, to be the anchor Martin now so desperately needed. "Son, I'm here," she said, her arms wrapping around his hunched form. Martin didn't respond at first. He just kept staring at the children through the window of the nursery, as if by staring long enough, he could find answers in their innocent faces. His heart clenched each time he looked at the darker-skinned twin. The questions gnawed at him. Sophia had never given him a reason to doubt her. She had been nothing but devoted. But how, in the name of everything holy, could they have a black child? "What's going on, Martin? Who's taking care of them?" Rosa's voice was gentle but firm, her eyes searching his face. When he finally looked at her, she saw the brokenness in her son, a shattered heart barely holding itself together. "Mom," his voice cracked. "Mom, I don't know if they're mine." The words fell between them, heavy and laden with sorrow. Rosa, stunned, took a moment to respond. "Martin, they're yours because Sophia wanted them to be yours. You need to accept that, my dear boy." But he couldn't, not with the seeds of doubt blooming into a forest of unanswered questions. By the next week, whispers had already started to circulate in the small town. How could it not? A white mother, a white father, and yet one white baby, one black. The neighbors, the women at the grocery store, even his colleagues at the mechanic shop. Their eyes followed Martin wherever he went. Whispers surrounded him, words like, affair, and truth becoming his shadow. And one afternoon, as Martin dragged himself through the aisles of the local supermarket, he could hear them, the whispers that dripped with suspicion and judgment. "I heard one of those babies is black," a woman's voice hissed, barely a whisper, but loud enough to pierce through Martin's emotional armor. "I wonder if Sophia, you know." Martin's hands tightened around the handle of the shopping cart, his knuckles turning white. Rage boiled inside him, a fierce, relentless rage. How dare they? How dare they talk about Sophia, who wasn't even there to defend herself? He wanted to scream, to tell them they didn't know what they were talking about. But deep down, he wondered, did they know something he didn't? That evening, Martin found himself at Pedro's bar, the dim lights casting long shadows as he downed drink after drink. Pedro, a friend since childhood, looked at him with concern, but kept his distance until Martin finally spoke, his voice a broken murmur. "Pedro, what if they're not mine? What if she lied to me?" Pedro sighed, leaning against the bar. "Martin, man, I can't pretend to know what happened. But you can't let this destroy you. You've lost Sophia. Don't lose yourself too. Those kids need you, whoever they are, however they look." But it wasn't that simple. Nothing about this was simple. In a world where black and white were supposed to be just colors, they were everything. The line between trust and betrayal, between love and heartbreak. And as Martin looked into his glass, he saw the future there, murky and uncertain, like the swirling liquor. Back at home, Rosa took over the care of the babies, while Martin drowned himself in work at the mechanic shop. He avoided looking at the twins for too long. Every time he did, a wave of pain and confusion swept over him, and he couldn't help but wonder, what if the truth was even more painful than he could bear? The tension in the household was stifling. Rosa watched her son, her heart aching for him and the grandchildren he was keeping at arm's length. She could feel the distance growing, not just between Martin and the babies, but between Martin and himself. He was losing himself in the questions, in the prejudice of a community that couldn't accept what they didn't understand. But Rosa was determined to fight. She held those babies close, whispered stories of their mother into their tiny ears, and promised herself that no matter what, she would not let them feel the coldness that was slowly consuming their father. Martin sat on his front porch late one evening, his eyes fixed on the darkening horizon. The wind carried the distant sound of laughter from the neighbors' children playing down the street, a sound that should have brought peace, but instead brought only emptiness. He closed his eyes, letting the night breeze wash over him. Sophia was gone, and what she had left behind was something Martin wasn't sure he could face. His phone buzzed on the table next to him. He picked it up, squinting at the bright screen. It was a message from Rosa, sent from inside the house. It simply read, "They need you, Martin. We need you." Martin swallowed hard, the lump in his throat almost choking him. He stood up, his legs heavy as lead, and turned to the door. It was time to meet his children, truly meet them, and maybe, just maybe, find a piece of the truth he so desperately needed. But as he reached for the doorknob, a shiver ran down his spine, as if the worst was yet to come. The morning sun bathed the house in warmth, but inside, Martin's heart was cold. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee that had long gone cold. He stared at the twins, who lay innocently in their cribs in the adjacent room. Rosa, as always, was tending to them, her whispers filled with the kind of love that Martin was now struggling to find. The contrast between the two babies was stark. Diego, the fair-skinned twin, looked like a small version of Sophia, a reminder of the woman Martin had loved, the woman he had lost. But then there was Aiden, with his deep brown skin and eyes that seemed to stare right into Martin's soul. Each time Martin looked at him, he could feel the doubt like a physical weight in his chest. Was Aiden really his? Or was he proof of something more sinister, something that would make him question everything he knew about Sophia? The whispers in the town had only grown louder. The neighbors no longer hid their curious glances. They stared, unflinching, whenever Martin or Rosa stepped outside. He could feel the judgment, the unspoken words hanging in the air whenever he walked into a store or passed by the mechanic shop. Even his co-workers, men he'd shared years with, started treating him differently. Pedro tried to stand by him, but Martin could see the curiosity in his eyes too. "Martin, you gotta stop avoiding this," Pedro said one afternoon at the shop. "Look, man, the guys are talking, and I don't care what they say, I know you. But you've got to settle this. Take the test, know the truth." Martin clenched his jaw, anger boiling inside him. Why should he have to prove anything? But the nagging feeling wouldn't leave. He needed answers, not just for himself, but for Sophia's memory, for Diego, and for Aiden. That night, Martin finally caved. Rosa had gone to bed, exhausted from another long day of caring for the twins, and Martin found himself sitting in front of the computer, staring at the website for a DNA testing company. He knew what he had to do, and yet his hands shook as he typed in his information and confirmed the order for a test kit. It would be simple enough, a swab from himself, from Diego, and from Aiden. The truth, cold and clinical, was just a few days away. Now, 2 days later, Martin found himself standing in line at the grocery store, the DNA kit discreetly tucked into the plastic bag at his side. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with the cashier, but he could still feel the eyes of the other customers on him. "Is that him?" a voice whispered from behind. "The one with the twins?" "Yeah, that's him," another voice responded, dripping with suspicion. "They say one of them's black. Wonder who the father is." Martin's fists clenched around the handle of the bag. He wanted to turn around, to shout at them, to make them understand that he was just as confused as they were. But he knew it wouldn't matter. They wouldn't listen. They had already decided what the truth was. The following week felt like an eternity. Martin tried to keep his distance from the twins, but every time Aiden cried, something in him twisted. Rosa could see it too. "You can't keep pushing him away, Martin," she said one evening, her voice gentle but firm. "Whatever the test says, he's still your son. Sophia wanted him to be yours." "But what if—" Martin couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. What if Aiden wasn't his? What if Sophia had betrayed him in the worst possible way? He loved her. He trusted her. But how could he ignore what was right in front of him? Rosa sighed, placing a hand on his shoulder. "No matter what, those boys need their father. And if you turn your back on Aiden now, you'll lose them both." The day the results arrived, Martin could barely breathe. He locked himself in his room, the envelope trembling in his hands. Slowly, he tore it open, his eyes scanning the words that would change everything. The results indicate that both twins share the same father. Martin blinked, his mind reeling. He read the words again and again until they finally sunk in. Aiden was his. All this time he had doubted. He had let the whispers and the stares and the color of his son's skin make him question everything. And now here it was in black and white. The truth. Aiden was his son. He felt relief but also regret. Deep, aching regret. He had let the world's prejudices creep into his own heart, had let himself believe that the color of Aiden's skin somehow mattered more than the love he had for his wife and children. And now as he stood there, the paper trembling in his hands, he realized how wrong he had been. But the test didn't change everything. The neighbors still whispered. People still stared. And the twins, innocent as they were beginning to notice. Diego was old enough to see the way people looked at them, the way they treated his brother differently. He heard the comments at the park, the way other parents would pull their children away when Aiden got too close. "Why don't they like Aiden, Daddy?" Diego asked one afternoon, his wide eyes filled with confusion. "He didn't do anything wrong." Martin swallowed hard, his heart breaking at the innocence in his son's voice. "No, Diego, he didn't do anything wrong. Some people they don't understand. They're afraid of what's different." Diego frowned, his small brows furrowing. "But Aiden's not different. He's my brother." Martin forced a smile, pulling Diego into his arms. "Yes, he is, and he always will be. Don't you ever let anyone make you think otherwise." Martin's determination to protect his sons only grew stronger, but so did the challenges they faced. At the grocery store, a mother pulled her child away when Aiden reached out to play. At the park, the twins were ignored, other children's parents whispering as they gathered their kids and moved to another part of the playground. One day, as Martin was working at the mechanic shop, an old friend, James, came by. Martin had known James since high school, But that day, James looked at him differently. So, Martin, James began, his voice awkward. I heard about the twins. Is it true? One of them's, black? Martin's jaw clenched. He could feel his pulse pounding in his temples. Yeah, James, they're both mine, he replied, his voice laced with barely controlled anger. James raised his hands as if in surrender. Hey, man, I'm not saying anything. Just people talk, It's just kind of strange. Martin stared at his old friend, his chest tight with rage. Strange? It's only strange because people like you keep making it strange. They're my sons. End of story. James shrugged, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. Sure, whatever you say. Just don't expect everyone else to be as understanding. Martin watched as James walked away, his words echoing in his mind. Understanding. It wasn't understanding they needed. It was acceptance. And that, it seemed, was harder to come by than anything else. That night, Martin sat with Rosa, the twins asleep in the next room. He could still hear Aiden's soft breathing, the gentle rise and fall that seemed to soothe something deep inside him. Rosa watched him, her eyes filled with the kind of knowing only a mother could possess. They'll be okay, Martin, she said softly, her hand resting on his. It's not going to be easy. The world can be cruel, but they have you, and they have each other. That's more than a lot of kids get. Martin nodded, his throat tight with emotion. I wish people could see them for who they are, not for what they look like. Rosa smiled sadly. Maybe one day they will, but until then, we fight. For them, for Sophia, for everything she believed in. Martin looked at his mother, her strength giving him strength, and as he listened to the steady breathing of his children, he knew she was right. He couldn't change the world overnight, but he could be the father his boys deserved, no matter what. The day of the neighborhood gathering had arrived. It was an annual tradition, a barbecue, a celebration of the community. But for Martin, it was just another opportunity for people to stare, to judge, and to whisper. He knew that attending would be a test, not only for himself but for his family. Rosa encouraged him, telling him it was time to face them head on, to show that he wasn't ashamed of his sons. Martin took a deep breath, carrying Aiden on his left arm while holding Diego's hand. They walked into the gathering together, Rosa following closely behind, her eyes watchful. The murmurs started almost immediately, and Martin could feel every glance, every lingering stare that burned into his skin. He tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the twins who were giggling excitedly at the sight of the balloons and games. But then came the breaking point. One of the neighbors, Mr. Thompson, an older man who had lived on the block for decades, approached with a forced smile. Martin, nice to see you here, he said, his eyes flickering briefly to Aiden, his smile fading just slightly. And these must be your boys. Though I gotta say, it's curious, isn't it? How different they are. Martin felt his blood run cold, his muscles tensing as he tried to keep his emotions in check. Yeah, they're different, he said, his voice strained. But they're both mine, Thompson, and that's all that matters. Thompson chuckled, a hollow sound that made Martin's skin crawl. Sure. I just wonder, what people will think when they see them. People talk, Martin couldn't take it anymore. The rage that had been simmering for weeks, months even, finally boiled over. He stepped closer to Thompson, his voice low but filled with anger. Maybe people should mind their own damn business, Thompson. Maybe they should stop judging a child by the color of his skin. You ever think of that? Thompson's smile vanished, and he took a step back, his eyes widening. Hey now, I didn't mean anything by it, he muttered. But Martin was already turning away, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel everyone's eyes on him, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. As Martin walked away, the whispers grew louder. He could hear fragments of conversations, words like angry, unstable, and aggressive. People were afraid of him now, not just curious. They saw his anger, his frustration, and instead of understanding it, they feared it. They didn't understand what it felt like to constantly be under scrutiny, to have every aspect of your family questioned and judged. Rosa hurried after him, her face a mix of concern and pride. "You did what you had to do, Martin," she said softly as she caught up to him. "People like Thompson, they don't change overnight, but at least you stood up for your sons." Martin nodded, but his heart still felt heavy. He looked down at Aiden, who was clutching his shirt, his wide eyes filled with confusion. Diego, too, seemed unsure, his small hand squeezing Martin's tightly. "It's okay, boys," Martin said, his voice softening. "We're going home." Later that night, as the family sat together in the living room, there was a knock on the door. Martin's heart sank. He wasn't sure he was ready for whatever confrontation lay beyond that door. Rosa shot him a questioning glance, and Martin slowly stood, his legs feeling heavy as he walked to the door and opened it. To his surprise, it wasn't a neighbor or even the police, as he had feared. It was Mrs. Morales, the principal of the local school. She smiled at him warmly, her eyes flickering to Rosa and the twins who were peeking around the corner. "Martin, may I come in?" she asked. Martin blinked, stepping aside. "Of course. What brings you here, Mrs. Morales?" She entered, taking a seat at the kitchen table as Martin and Rosa followed. "I heard about what happened at the neighborhood gathering," she began, her voice gentle. "And I wanted to say, I admire what you did, Martin. It's not easy, standing up against that kind of prejudice. And it's not just about today. I've seen what your boys go through at school. I've heard the things people say." Martin felt his throat tighten. He hadn't realized just how far-reaching the whispers had become. "They're just kids," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They don't deserve this." Mrs. Morales nodded, her expression kind. "I agree. That's why I've come. I want to start a new program at the school, one focused on diversity, on teaching kids about acceptance. And I was hoping you'd be willing to share your story, to help us show people what real courage looks like." Martin was stunned into silence. For so long, he had been the target of whispers and stares. He had never imagined that his story, his struggle, could be something that helped others, something that inspired change. He looked at Rosa, who nodded, her eyes filled with tears of pride. I don't know what to say," Martin finally managed, his voice breaking. "I'd be honored. Anything to help my boys, to help other families like ours." Mrs. Morales smiled, standing up. "Thank you, Martin. You're stronger than you know. And your boys, they're lucky to have a father like you." As she left, Martin closed the door behind her, turning back to his family. The weight that had been pressing down on him for so long seemed to lift, just a little. He knew there would still be challenges, still be whispers and judgment. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. The next day, Martin sat down with Diego and Aiden, pulling them close. "Boys," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want you to know something. I love you both more than anything in this world. And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you grow up in a place that treats you right. You deserve that." Diego looked up at his father, his eyes wide. "We know, Daddy. We love you too." Aiden, still too young to fully understand, simply smiled, reaching up to touch Martin's face. Martin felt tears sting his eyes as he hugged them both tightly. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. He knew there would be people who would never accept his family no matter what. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had Rosa. He had people like Mrs. Morales. And most importantly, he had his sons. Together they would face whatever came their way, and they would do it with love, with strength, and with an unbreakable bond that no amount of prejudice could ever shatter. Word of Mrs. Morales' initiative spread throughout the community, and while not everyone was supportive, something began to shift. Slowly, people started to come around. Martin noticed small changes. The mother at the park who used to pull her child away now allowed her daughter to play with Aiden. The cashier at the grocery store smiled at them, rather than looking away. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The school launched the diversity program, and Martin shared his story in front of students and parents. He spoke of his love for Sophia, of the joy of becoming a father, and of the pain of losing her. He spoke of his doubts, his fears, and how he had let the color of his child's skin make him question everything. He spoke of his realization that love was stronger than prejudice, and that his sons were worth fighting for. As he finished, the room was silent, tears glistening in the eyes of many of those gathered. Martin looked out at the crowd, seeing faces that had once judged him now looking at him with something else, something like respect. He felt a sense of peace, a sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The years ahead would not be easy. Martin knew that. There would always be people like Thompson, people who couldn't see past the color of a child's skin. But there would also be people like Mrs. Morales, people willing to fight for change, to stand up for what was right. And as Martin watched his sons grow, watched them laugh and play without a care in the world, he knew that the fight was worth it. For them, for Sophia, for a future where love was stronger than hate, and where a child's worth was never measured by the color of their skin. Martin smiled, his heart full. He had faced the darkness, and he had come out the other side. And now, with his family by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next, together. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. This story is more than just about one man's struggle. It's about the systemic challenges many families face, challenges that stem from prejudice and division. If this story touched you, if it made you reflect on the world we live in and the change we need to see, then now is the time to act. It is up to all of us to create a world where children can grow up loved and supported, regardless of the color of their skin. Your voice matters, and by using it to stand against hate, you can help pave the way for a future where acceptance and understanding are the norm, not the exception. Let Martin's story be a reminder that real change starts within our communities, with each of us making the decision to see beyond the surface and recognize our shared humanity. Share this story with those around you, start a conversation, and commit to being a force for empathy and progress. Together, we can dismantle the barriers of prejudice, one act of kindness at a time. Join us in this journey toward a better future, because no one should ever have to prove their worth based on the color of their skin. Let's build a world where love truly conquers hate, and where every child can grow up knowing they are valued, cherished, and seen for who they truly are.